Paul Loeb, an old friend and social activist, author of numerous books, including the just re-released, The Impossible Will Take a Little While. He also wrote Soul of a Citizen, Living with Conviction in Challenging Times as well. Website paulloeb, LOEB.org, is on the line with us. Hey, Paul, welcome back to the program.
It's so good to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've talked. I hope all is well with you and your family and all the work that you're doing.
It is. Too much work, but that's chronic. So
yeah,
it's when you're doing the good work.
That's our lives. So tell me about the re-release here, The Impossible Will Take a Little While.
Well, basically, The Impossible came out originally in 2004 and actually did pretty well. It was on the bestseller list of the independent bookstores for about 11 weeks. And then publisher ran out over the holidays. That kind of broke the momentum. And it's been in print ever since. I think there's 23, 24 printings. But what it seemed to me is that after a decade, that it was just time to update the book. And in some ways, it's a book on political hope, and with all sorts of amazing authors, and Nelson Mandela, and Alice Walker, and Jim Wallace, and Paul Hawken, and Wendell Berry, and just Bill McKibben's in there. And what I wanted to do is to bring it up to date for this current time, because in some ways, when it came out, certainly a lot of people I knew were feeling pretty bleak. But in other ways, this is almost a harder time because you had the sort of rise of hopes of a lot of people for Obama, and then suddenly the change a lot of people hoped for didn't occur. You see the steady march of climate change, the widening inequality. I mean, we don't need to go into all the issues, but it's a difficult time. And so to my mind, it just seemed like it was useful to bring in some new stories of people talking about doing the impossible. And the original edition, I had a lot of examples from, I guess I would call it the most difficult situations one could imagine. So what did it take for Nelson Mandela and his compatriots to be there in that Robben Island prison and yet maintain hope? What was it like for Václav Havel and his compatriots in Czechoslovakia? What was it like for the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina? What was it like here in the U.S. in the sort of most viciously violent years of the civil rights movement? So I had a lot of those kinds of examples because I always feel like when people say, oh, there's nothing I can do, or it's too hard, one of my responses is, well, yeah, it's difficult, but are you really saying it's more difficult than it was in apartheid South Africa or the communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe or any of the other kind of really difficult situations? And so that was always the core of the book. But now I've sort of added new, more recent examples. So you look at the Arab Spring, and you could say certainly things are they're not real pretty right now. I mean, at least in Egypt, it's pretty ugly. But I remember interviewing. I have a couple very, very powerful stories in the new version of The Impossible Will Take a Little While from the Arab Spring. And I remember talking with a young Egyptian woman who I met at one of the colleges where I was speaking last fall, and she said, yeah, it's hard, and it's not exactly the way people wanted to see it turn out, but that there was a whole generation that learned courage and a whole generation that learned to stand up, and that they were simply not going to forget that. And at that point, they'd overthrown 2 dictators, and they were ready to continue and overthrow a third if need be. And so part of the challenge of when you do a book about political hope is you don't want it to be naive, and you don't want it to be sentimental and sort of like, oh, let's just all wish for unicorns and everything will be wonderful. This is a messy, at some points pretty cruel world with huge institutions of power that we're up against. And so you want to be realistic in saying, yep, this is what we're against. This is what we have to change. This is the magnitude of it. And yet people have done it in other times. So one of the favorite pieces that I added was a piece of Bill Moyer's about the populists and the progressives, and at a period when it just looked like the Gilded Age robber barons had just a lockdown on the American politics, and yet somehow people were able to overcome it. Is it exactly the same as now? Well, of course not. But at the same time, you have an example.
And it wasn't somehow. I mean, it was the crash of 1896.
But it was also the persistence of all those other movements.
Sure.
That extended, up through the New Deal, where people were keeping on. And when something happens like a crash, suddenly there are people out there. They're talking.
Then there's a galvanizing instance.
There's a galvanizing instance, exactly. And there's connectivity instead of isolation.
Right.
And part of the challenge is it's not to say that, if you look at the polls, most people acknowledge that we're in a mess. The question is, do they feel they can do anything about it? And are they in the kinds of situation, or there's actual organizing going on where people are talking to each other, where they feel, oh yes, we can try this, and you never know what's going to happen. I mean, I was stunned. I guess this was late yesterday. It broke. 32 years ago, I was kicked out of Stanford University for anti-war activism, and Stanford just agreed to divest from coal. And people can say, oh, it's no big deal, or it's only partial, but that's huge, and that was entirely due to a movement of the students on the campus pushing for it.
Right.
And so, so you look at it, one of the things that happens, I think, is that we sort of exceptionalize our successes and say, oh, well, that doesn't really matter. So I've got some sections in the new version of The Impossible will take a little while on the gay rights movement. And it's easy to say, oh, well, that was just inevitable and it was foreordained. But certainly 30, 40 years ago, if you were speaking
or for the last 7,000 years.
Or for the last 7,000 years, it hardly seemed safe or costless or foreordained.
Right.
Which is not to say that it's that the battle is entirely fought, but it's so easy for us to be able to sort of dismiss our victories. And part of what I like, the phrase I use was two phrases. One is Nelson Mandela talks about the multiplication of courage, phrase I really like. One person can be inspired by a completely different movement in a completely different historical time to do something where they happen to be. The other notion is that that I came up with is that these kinds of successes are transferable. So that is, you can take a lesson, and it may be from a nonviolent struggle of 50 or 100 years ago, you can use that to today. You can transfer a movement against inequality and use its lessons in terms of climate change. You can look at the civil rights movement and draw hope from its persistence. So part of what I think people need to do is to be able to get past that isolation.
There
that's
you go.
what The Impossible is about.
Paul Loeb, he's the author of a whole bunch of really great books. Soul of a Citizen is a classic, but his new book, or his book, The Impossible Will Take a Little While, has been updated and reissued. It's just out now. Check it out. The Impossible Will Take a Little While. You can check it out at his website, paulloeb, LOEB.org. Thanks, Paul.